That wizard came from the moon. It's the finale of Super NES Works Episode 21. The first time I played Square Enix's DS remake of the original Final Fantasy III, I was struck by a curious realization. Final Fantasy IV, that is Final Fantasy II on Super NES, was in fact little more than a Final Fantasy III fanfiction. In fact, this discovery helped inspire me to launch the Retronauts podcast, just so I could talk about it. Final Fantasy III had introduced to the franchise the job system, which built on Dragon Quest III's class change mechanic and turned a memorable moment of the original Final Fantasy, that is Bahamut's bequeathing of prestige classes upon the Warriors of Light, into a core mechanic. The job system allowed players to swap their character specialties more or less at leisure, and in order to do so, it more than doubled the number of available classes over those of the first game. Here in Final Fantasy II, you see almost all of those classes return, but this time you have no control over their use or application. Instead, each class is embodied by a different character. The role they play in the story is often bound inextricably to their specialty. Functionally, this acts as a brilliant counterpart to the game's use of combat staging for storytelling. Final Fantasy II doubles down on this concept by making the actual workings of combat a function of the story as well. If FF2 has a claim to being a true and proper RPG, this is where it happens. The marriage of characterization and combat mechanics you find here feels like the sort of emergent narrative you get from a truly great tabletop session, even if in this case it's carefully scripted from start to finish. Even if FF2 wasn't directly adapted from a team of friends rolling dice together, it certainly feels like it belongs to the tradition of writers turning their memorable tabletop campaigns into a work of media. Think Record of Lodoss War, that sort of thing. Final Fantasy II is very much in that vein, but instead of being based on a D&D session, it's based on Final Fantasy III. The story here feels for all the world like the scenario designers took the raw materials of the job system and wrote a fun story about how different specialists could relate. There's a bit of overlap between roles as characters rotate into and out of the party, but it works. On the most basic mechanical level, you have specific scenarios geared around predetermined teams and combat skills. For instance, the Fiend of Wind, Volvalis, would be impossible to defeat without the presence of Kane Highwind, the Dragoon whose jump attack is the only thing that can force Volvalis out of her invincible spin state. Some dungeons are built entirely to emphasize play mechanics for the sake of storytelling. Take, for example, Cecil's journey to Mount Ordeals. It's a turning point in his personal quest, one of two legitimate prestige class upgrades in the game. Cecil begins as a Dark Knight, a class that debuted in Final Fantasy III as a sort of physical class cannon. Dark Knights hit hard but have lower defensive stats than standard knights, and their special abilities offer powerful effects at the cost of sapping the user's health. For Cecil, the concept of Dark Knight implies power but a tendency toward evil. Indeed, his strongest Dark Knight weapon is imbued with an instant kill status effect capable of slaying even powerful foes in a single strike. But the trip up Mount Ordeals also reveals the weakness of a Dark Knight. They're practically useless against dark element monsters like the undead. Mount Ordeals is quite a struggle since the paths are thick with zombies and other undead. The closer you get to the mountain's peak, the more you're forced to rely on your spellcasters to save the day, because Cecil's sword can't hurt the undead. But once he relinquishes the Dark Blade in favor of a paladin's holy sword, Cecil becomes a fearsome force on the way back down the mountainside. And although Cecil's stats reset to level 1 once he changes to the Paladin class, just like they would in Final Fantasy III, his new specialty emphasizes defense, meaning he has nearly as many hit points as a level 1 Paladin as he did as a level 15 Dark Knight. A few other characters undergo meaningful changes too. Rydia spends a decade or so unstuck in time in the land of summoned monsters and returns an adult, upgrading from an Evoker Red Mage combo to a Summoner Black Mage, more limited in the breadth of her powers, but far more capable in the areas in which she does specialize. Final Fantasy II isn't afraid to limit character abilities for the sake of telling its tale. For example, Rydia's entire village is wiped out in a fiery act of sabotage, and for the first few hours of her journey, she can cast a number of black magic spells, but not fire magic. It's not until she overcomes her trauma that fire class skills are added to her repertoire. Likewise, Tella is a revered sage with a total mastery of white and black magic, but in his old age he's forgotten many of the more advanced abilities of his younger days. Only when Cecil becomes a paladin does Tella remember his full complement of spells, opening up even more powerful capabilities than he commanded before. However, Tella's age is still a factor here. He always has 90 magic points with which to cast spells, whereas the younger mages in the game can eventually end up with 300 or 400 points. This forces players to be economical with Tella's magic even after he unlocks spells like Nuke and Ice 3. 90 magic points is only enough mana to cast a level 3 elemental spell 3 times, and not even enough to squeeze out 2 uses of Nuke. If you want to hit hard with Tella, who has monstrous magical skills and can wipe out a fair few enemy formations in a single action, you'll have to spend a lot of his combat time trying to siphon magic points from bad guys with the Psych spell in order to fuel his actions. Of course, the real reason for Tella's hard 90-point MP cap is all about the narrative. After all, the devastating Medio spell costs 99 MP. That means it's impossible for players to cast Medio with Tella in the normal course of combat. Although he knows the spell, you can literally never see it in action due to his deficient mana pool. Medio only appears when Tella flies into a rage during his scripted battle against Golbez. After he burns through more than half of his max MP casting ineffectual spells against the villain, Tella commits to spending his life force to unleash his ultimate ability for the sake of revenge. In other words, Tella destroys himself in a manner consistent with the game's mechanics. He casts a spell that exceeds his physical limits in one final, desperate act of vengeance. It's a brilliant translation of the quantified numeric nature of RPG stats into something human and organic. You see a similar idea at work a little earlier in the adventure, when Palom and Porom cast a petrifaction spell on themselves to keep the party from being crushed by a trap rune. The game allows you to attempt to use healing items on them, but those have no effect, because the twins willingly accepted the negative status condition. For everyone who has ever seen a plot-related death in an RPG and wondered, why not just use a revival spell? The dialogue prompt when you examine the frozen twins is a neat little acknowledgement of combat mechanics within the narrative. The presence of game mechanics within a narrative framework would become a trademark of the Final Fantasy series after this. Think Galuf passing along his job abilities to Creel in Final Fantasy V, the pros and cons of Final Fantasy VIII's Guardian Forces, or Final Fantasy Tactics' Ramza shouting in a panic for Phoenix Down after accidentally and comically killing Mustadio the Engineer in a lighthearted cutscene. But like the active time battle system, you can make a strong argument that Final Fantasy never married the two facets of the game experience quite as well as it's done here. Even minor details of combat skills in Final Fantasy II help sell your party's characterization. Edward, for example, is a frail weakling who has no business being in combat, and one of his special abilities in battle is the power to hide and literally leave everyone else to deal with his problems. Likewise, Cecil as a paladin has the opposite power. He can cover an ally and soak up all the physical damage in their stead, which can be a huge help when, say, you're trying to keep Rydia alive long enough to chant some top-level skill. Meanwhile, during his time as a Dark Knight, Cecil's special powers allow him to hit all enemies with a dark wave of energy in exchange for his own health. Or rather, that should be what his special powers do. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Final Fantasy II. Alas, Squaresoft wasn't convinced Americans were ready yet for a full frontal assault of role-playing reality. So they greatly streamlined Final Fantasy IV in the process of localizing it to Final Fantasy II. The US release is a materially different game than Final Fantasy IV, enough so that Square ended up reissuing a variant of this revamped edition in Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. And that should give you a good sense of what the US release was all about. Final Fantasy II dials back the difficulty of the Japanese original considerably, toning down enemy encounters and minimizing some of the nastier challenges in order to make the adventure more approachable for less experienced role-playing gamers. Final Fantasy IV was already pretty easy compared to the infamously brutal Famicom releases of Final Fantasy II and III, and the easy-type modifications it saw for the US made it even less challenging. For example, Final Fantasy II retains the various status effects that appear in the Japanese version, but where the original game included individual curative items and spells to heal each effect one by one, Final Fantasy II abandoned things like the Gold Needle and Maiden's Kiss in favor of a single, inexpensive heal item and a catch-all heal spell. Rather than needing to remedy each ailment individually, you can clear them up all in one go, pretty cheaply. This makes the game vastly easier, especially when you face enemies like Malbols, which begin each battle by blasting a single character with every status effect in the book: Frog, Berserk, Mute, Mini, Poison, and more. In Final Fantasy IV, Malbols are incredibly difficult to recover from, since each negative status effect has to be addressed individually or negated with the costly Esuna spell. Here, they require the use of a single cheap spell or item, which really minimizes the horror of these encounters. Not needing to tote around granular healing items also frees up half a dozen slots of the limited inventory space for more valuable purposes. In combat, many of the player's party members have lost their special combat abilities for Final Fantasy II. Rosa, for example, retains her aim ability, which guarantees a critical strike for bow attacks. At the same time, she loses the Pray skill that works as a no-cost group healing spell. Yang can still use his Kick group attack, but he can't use Gird or Power to allow him to double his defense or offense for a turn. Likewise, Palom and Porum retain the Twin skill that allows them to team up to cast unique, powerful randomized spells. But they lose their special Bluff and Cry abilities, respectively. And Tella loses his Recall ability, which in the early going can be very helpful. In Final Fantasy IV, Recall allows Tella to randomly cast a high-level spell from his forgotten repertoire. But that's not an option here. But where the easy-type tweaks really hurt is for our leading man, Cecil. As a Dark Knight, Cecil is supposed to be able to use Dark Wave, a skill that allows him to trade a chunk of health in order to hit a group of enemies. It's a costly power, but it's emblematic of Cecil's cursed nature as a Dark Knight. It's also the key to his transformation into a paladin. In order to take up the Holy Sword, Cecil has to defeat a reflection of his Dark Knight self. The Dark Knight Wraith can't be overpowered through standard combat, so the solution, of course, is simply to defend and let the reflection burn out its own hit points through using Dark Wave. But since the player doesn't have access to Dark Wave in the normal course of gameplay, this becomes a lot less intuitive and meaningful than it was meant to be. Without having seen the Dark Knight's power in action in Final Fantasy II, you don't realize that it burns hit points, and that its reflection will eventually destroy itself. Whoops. The simplified gameplay is hardly the extent of Final Fantasy II's localization issues. It has one of the most infamously poor English translations of its era, with dialogue ranging from merely passable to utterly baffling. Squaresoft would make a more diligent effort to give their English language work a decent workover in the future, but this was their unhappy learning curve. The game loses a lot of character and plot information from the Japanese version due to space limitations, and what does carry over into English doesn't always scan. It wouldn't be until the Game Boy Advance remake with its comprehensive retranslation that all the subplots would finally come through in English, and key plot points would finally become coherent. So given all of that, what does come through uncompromised in the US release? Well, the answer is the music. Nobuo Uematsu had cranked out some solid tunes in the past, but Final Fantasy II marks a turning point for his career. This is easily one of the Super NES's best soundtracks of 1991, standing toe-to-toe with Yuzo Koshiro's ACTRAISER. While Final Fantasy II lacks the stunning "how is my console making this music" sensation of ACTRAISER, it's a more musically complete work as a whole. In particular, Uematsu uses recurring themes to brilliant effect here. This comes through in the game's main theme, which appears throughout the adventure in countless permutations. Every overworld tune riffs on the main theme, and variants appear in other forms as well. Many characters have their own themes too, which appear throughout the game as leitmotifs. And that's where we see the real strength of this soundtrack. Although there's a lot less music here in terms of individual track count than would appear in subsequent Final Fantasy games, Uematsu weaves together recurring elements efficiently and effectively. There are some really incredible battle themes in Final Fantasy II, from the almost mariachi-like standard battle theme to the grand bombastic tune that plays when you battle the 4 elemental fiends. Equally striking are the special battle themes, such as the whimsical Calliope tune that becomes immensely creepy when you face the Calbrena dolls, or the suitably cosmic final battle theme. It's really the slower and quieter pieces here that sell the game's story, though. Whether it's the theme of love that underscores Edward's reconciliation with the ghost of his lost love, or Rydia's theme tying together the two different versions of her you meet throughout the game, Final Fantasy II's soundtrack works like a movie score. The idea of switching musical tracks to fit a story scene was still fairly new and different in gaming at this point, and it goes a long way toward making Final Fantasy II's best moments stand out. Even with its localization flaws, all of this adds up to a game that punches above its weight. As RPGs go, Final Fantasy II is quick and breezy. Even if you pursue all possible side quests, including the high-level battles locking away legendary weapons on the moon, you'd be hard-pressed to squeeze 20 hours out of this adventure. But it represents such a huge step forward in terms of both in-game storytelling and mechanical innovation for its time that you can't really blame it for its brevity. And yes, there's very little traditional role-playing here, not to mention a profound lack of the player freedom you expect from the genre, but even that feels like a critical experimental step towards something great. Final Fantasy II is easily one of the absolute best Super NES games of 1991. The Super NES's library has been pretty choppy so far. So why do so many people regard Super NES as the greatest system of all time? It's because of games like this, and Super Mario World, and ACTRAISER, and Castlevania 4. Unsurprisingly, Square Enix has been diligent about keeping Final Fantasy II, or rather Final Fantasy IV, in circulation. I don't think there's a truly definitive English language release of the game, but the PSP and DS releases are probably your best bet in terms of authenticity and challenge. Sadly, Squaresoft would be slow to capitalize on Final Fantasy II's modest success in the US, and we wouldn't see the company release a worthy follow-up for another 2 years. But Final Fantasy II would open the door for a number of other RPG contenders, few of which would be quite this good admittedly. But Super NES is regarded as an RPG fan's paradise for good reason, and this is one of them. Next time we go from paradise to hell. Thanks for nothing, Tokuro Fujiwara.